As we've been reporting, today marks the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Well, while he is a defining figure in the civil rights movement, do Americans have amnesia about Dr. King? Michael Eric Dyson, a writer and professor of sociology at Georgetown University, explores that in his new book, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King, Jr.'s Death and How It Changed America. Mr. Dyson, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
You know, so many people, you think of Martin Luther King, you think of the civil rights hero, the I Have a Dream speech,
right,
which he made in 1963. He died in 1968, right, and what happened in between affected the way a lot of Americans felt about him on April 4th, 1968.
Absolutely.
What was the assessment of him on that date?
Well, before his death, he was a pariah to the mainstream of white America. He'd spoken out against the war in Vietnam. He had turned his attention to economic injustice. He said that the gains of 64 and 65 with the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act were merely surface. He was going for the deep structural changes. Martin Luther King Jr. said America must have a revolution of values. And so he opposed American foreign policy. He was dismissed and denigrated both by black leaders, Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young, as well as Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the black people who were the masses loved him, but he was becoming more relevant with black power. So he was a man between a rock and a hard place, and he spoke bitterly and acidly against the war in Vietnam.
So suddenly he became the angry black man.
He was an angry black man who no longer was a Nobel Peace Prize winner in the eyes of many, and he no longer was Dr. King with his dignity, and he was being seen as irrelevant, and he was marginalized in a very serious way by the American mainstream press.
You know, when in your book you write about his bouts with depression, his inability to sleep. He stopped taking sleeping pills because they didn't work anymore. His preoccupation with death. Why was it important for you to humanize him, to point out his frailties?
Well, first of all, because people think he was a saint and an icon. He was an extraordinary man. I think the greatest American who ever lived, arguably. But the point is, his flaws and his limitations are as critical to defining his humanity as the achievements that he was able to amass. Plus, we can't tell young people, you too can achieve what Dr. King did. You can aim for those high goals. You can aspire to that moral elevation if you, like him, will sacrifice and be able to focus your attention. But if we say to those young people, well, he was an icon, he was not a figure who's approachable, he was a hero who's distant from you, we won't be able to get the measure of the man. When
you look at the statistics, particularly in economic terms and racial terms as well, how far have we come in the 40 years, really?
Right. Well, if you're an African-American elite, if you have a tremendous education, you're doing well. If you are a poor person who's working or working poor or working class, you are a long way from the promised land. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that what we have to do now is to focus on bringing people closer to the larger circle of American privilege, and the black elite themselves bear a responsibility to reach over, down, and beneath themselves to pull up those other brothers and sisters, but the American government bears a huge responsibility in doing so. And Martin Luther King Jr. felt that the American government was doing a poor job. It was guns or butter. Either you're going to direct resources to a foreign escapade, or you're going to deal with the local domestic economy in a very serious fashion.
And finally, you make an interesting point in an op-ed today in the Los Angeles Times that Barack Obama and Reverend Wright are sort of the two sides of Martin Luther King.
Absolutely. When you think about it, Jeremiah Wright represents the later King from 1965 on. Barack Obama embraces the earlier King up until 1965. So they are the split mind, if you will, the divided soul of Martin Luther King Jr., both by chronology but also by color. Barack Obama represents how King spoke to mainstream white America. Reverend Jeremiah Wright represents how he spoke to black people. Remember, when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, in his effects was found the notes for the sermon for the next Sunday. The name of that sermon? Why America May Go to Hell. That's a Jeremiah Wright moment in a very serious way. If YouTube had existed when Martin Luther King Jr. were alive,
he'd be vilified.
He would be deeply demonized, marginalized, and vilified right to this day.
Michael Eric Dyson, fascinating book.
Thank you
so much for your perspective.
Thank you.
The book is April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Death and How It Changed America. We're back in a moment. This is Today on NBC.